I think we generally think of the old poets who had the job of reciting at dinner as being a passé occupation, but evidently that is not true. So, as it used to be in the tradition, you can fling ribs, chicken bones, or whatever, any stuff that you don't like here. I'm going to read from Omeros, and originally I was asked to give a talk. And one of the penalties, I think, of writing poetry is that you're always asked to give a talk. As if what you said in verse wasn't sufficient. You've either got to make it better by writing it in prose or simplifying it. So I've become very tough about giving talks. But what I think I'll try to do without being too long is to perhaps make an occasional comment on the setup of the sections that I'm going to read. I'm going to start from the very beginning of the book, which for some of you, and I thought later, what am I doing here? There may be people here who speak only French. So I will now speak French. You don't believe I can, right? I won't. I realize that a little late. The first section deals with the cutting down of trees to make canoes. This still goes on in the island of St. Lucia, where the book is set. And these trees are later run down to the beaches and hollowed out and burnt out and chipped with an adze to form the canoes. And the trees that they choose are generally what are called gommier trees or gum trees. And some canoes in the French Caribbean are called gommier after the tree. The word appears a lot in Glissant and Césaire and Chamoiseau and so on, French-speaking islands. But the shaping of those canoes was a Carib occupation, evidently. So those canoes are made from the canoe craft of the Caribs. Well, the Caribs have gone. But what happens in the book is that a tree is selected by a man called Achille, who is Achilles. And here I'm going to make a comment about some of the problems that have happened, which I knew would happen when I undertook to do this book, which I had to do. Because a book is not a template, it's not a copy or transposition of Homer. It would be an idiotic thing to do, to try to rewrite Homer. The best example of trying to rewrite a classic is in Borges, who talks about a man who liked Don Quixote so much that he began to copy it out, and he copied out the whole book exactly as it was. It is a great story. So the only way I could do anything to sort of equal Homer would be to copy Homer exactly. This was done anyway by Joyce in a totally different kind of way, as a template, as an underlying map over which he put his own contemporary version of Ulysses, incident by incident. The source of this relationship or reference is the fact that St. Lucia is called the Helen of the West Indies because of the beauty of the island and because it has been fought over several times and it changed hands about 13 times. The value of the Caribbean islands is inestimable from memory because cane was equivalent to uranium. I read that somewhere. The value of cane was that much. And at one point, there was a choice to be made about whether Britain should give over St. Lucia or Canada, and Canada lost. The choice that is made here of the tree by Achille, and again here is another reality and not just an imaginary reference. In the island of Groseilliers, there is a man I know called Achille, and his cousin's name is Hector. That is true. I suppose you probably think I'm going to say that he has a brother called Menelaus. No. What is very curious is the reality of these names, because I think the names that we call slave names are given not in contempt but in admiration. I think that if a slave was called Caesar, there were Caesarian qualities to his posture or look even. I don't think it was a sarcastic appellation. I really don't. I think that it was kind of oblique compliment when these names were given to people like Pompey or Caesar and so on. It's not satirical, I think, that somebody would be called Pompey because the last thing you would expect Pompey to look like is a little black man. No. I think because there were qualities in there that, however apparently cynical those names were, they were not basically that, I don't think. Anyway, the names Achille and Hector obviously have to refer to Homer. But the reality also is that the songs that children in St. Lucia sing, and one of the songs is Helen of the West, which is the St. Lucian name for St. Lucia, and it was called that by an English historian. When these songs are sung, they preserve the memory of Helen through songs that school children sing. So I find it astonishing that Homer should be perpetuated in the singing of children in St. Lucia about this fabulous woman. By fabulous, I mean of fable. The tree that is chosen then is a carob tree, a canoe, that is supposed to be occupied in spirit by the absent carob, or absent caribs. That tree is cut down and transformed into a canoe. But that canoe is the one that is going to take Achilles, in a moment of sunstroke, in a single instant, back to Africa. It is inevitable that any writer on this part of the world of African origin has to present a necessary journey, as necessary as anything in epic history, and that is the return, the imaginary or longed for actual return to Africa in search of some ancestry. And I'll read this section. But what I'm saying here is typical of the Caribbean, in that a man is cutting down a tree that the Caribs venerated, in which in a way he is destroying a god. And these multiple trees, all those trees are occupied in the pantheistic idea of the Carib by one tree, which is again the tree that might be the single tree of the crucifixion or whatever. And that's turned into a canoe, and that canoe takes him to Africa. So you have all these typical Caribbean contradictions, or rather not contradictions, but mergings of different religions and different sources into one perhaps symbolic kind of event. The person who describes the cutting down of the tree is a man called Philoctet, which Philoctetes in Greek. You always have in these villages, there's always one sort of iconic cripple, someone who carries the grief of the village. You find them all over. That person may be afflicted, he may be crippled in the terms of having one leg or some amputation or some burden that he carries, but he seems to carry also the grief of that village in the way that Philoctetes carried the grief from the wounding that happened to him and the suppurating sore. The suppurating sore that is there in Philoctetes, in Philoctet here, is of course the sore made by the chains of slavery. So he's describing to tourists at this point how the canoes are made. And he warns the tourists not to take too many pictures because they're stealing his soul. And then the canoes are launched and they hit the water and they become something else. They become practical canoes. I was once walking along the beach in St. Lucia and I saw a canoe that was marked "In God We Trust." And like you, I laughed at first. I giggled and I thought, God we trust, oh my God. But the man who took the time to write that name for the canoe had more faith than I, who was laughing at the spelling. because that extra U is the urgency and necessity of someone trying to express his debt and adoration and prayer in the spelling that he thought was correct. And that's much better than a lot of other people, including me, who do not have that devotion. So that raises the question of literacy, because an illiterate man would write, not an illiterate, but a man who doesn't know actual proper spelling would write "In God We Trust." But I kept it in the book because to me that vessel of the canoe that is called "In God We Trust" contains not only one faith but several, including the Carib's faith and the African's faith and the Caribbean faith. So Philoctet is describing cutting down of the canoes. This is how one sunrise we cut down them canoes. Philoctet smiles for the tourists who try taking his soul with their cameras. Once wind bring the news to the Laurier Canal, their leaves start shaking the minute the axe of sunlight hit the cedars, because they could see the axes in our own eyes. Wind lift the ferns. They sound like the sea that feed us fishermen all our life, and the ferns nodded, yes, the trees have to die. So fists jam in our jacket, because the heights was cold and our breath making feathers like the mist, we passed the rum. When it came back, it gave us the spirit to turn into murderers. I lift up the axe and pray for strength in my hands to wound the first cedar. Dew was filling my eyes, but I fire one more white rum, then we advance. For some extra silver under a sea almond, he shows them a scar made by a rusted anchor, rolling one trouser leg up with the rising moan of a conch. It has puckered like the corolla of a sea urchin. He does not explain its cure. It have some things, he smiles, worth more than $1. He has left it to a garrulous waterfall to pour out his secret down La Saucière, since the tall laurels fell, for the ground dove's mating call to pass on its note to the blue tacit mountains, whose talkative brooks, carrying it to the sea, turn into idle pools where the clear minnows shoot, and an egret stalks the reeds with one rusted cry as it stabs and stabs the mud with one lifting foot. Then silence is sawn in half by a dragonfly as eels sign their names along the clear bottom sand, when the sunrise brightens the river's memory and waves of huge ferns are nodding to the sea's sound. Although smoke forgets the earth from which it ascends, and nettles guard the holes where the laurels were killed, an iguana hears the axes, clouding each lens over its lost name, when the hunched island was called Iwanola, where the iguana is found. But taking its own time, the iguana will scale the rigging of vines in a year, its dewlap fanned, its elbows akimbo, its deliberate tail moving with the island. The slid pods of its eyes ripened in a pause that lasted for centuries, that arose with the arawak smoke, till a new race, unknown to the lizard, stood measuring the trees. These were the pillars that fell, leaving a blue space for a single god where the old god stood before. The first god was a gommier. The generator began with a whine, and a shark with its sidewise jaw sent the chips flying like mackerel over water into trembling weeds. Now they cut off the saw, still hot and shaking, to examine the wound it had made. They scraped off its gangrenous moss, then ripped the wound clear of the nether vines that still bound it to this earth, and nodded. The generator whipped back to its work, and the chips flew much faster as the shark's teeth gnawed evenly. They covered their eyes from the splintering nest. Now, over the pastures of bananas, the island lifted its horns. Sunrise trickled down its valleys. Blood splashed on the cedars, and the grove flooded with the light of sacrifice. A gommier was cracking, its leaves an enormous tarpaulin with the ridgepole gone. The creaking sound made the fishermen leap back as the angling mast leant slowly towards the troughs of ferns. Then the ground shuddered under their feet in waves. Then the waves passed. He goes out fishing in his canoe in God we trust, and he goes through a moment when he staggers from sunstroke and collapses for a while. But in that moment, which is as long and as short and as immeasurable as the length of a dream, a whole memory happens, because it is not that he actually arrives in Africa. It is the fact of the sunstroke that makes him enact or reenact the whole return to Africa in the moment of that sunstroke, in the same way that we can't measure time in dreams. But the canoe starts racing across the Atlantic, and it is being pulled by a small bird, by a sea swift. And now the canoe gathers speed and is crossing the Atlantic in his imagination and in his stunned delirium. Outrunner of flying fish, under the geometry of the hidden stars, her wire flashed and faded, taut as a catch, this might of the sky-touching sea, towing a pirogue 1,000 times her own weight, with a hummingbird's electric wings, this engine that shot ahead of each question like an answer, once Achille had questioned his name and its origin. She touched both worlds with her rainbow, this frail dancer leaping the breakers, this dart of the meridian. She could loop the stars with her fish line, she tired porpoises, she circled epochs with her outstretched span. She gave a straight answer when one was required. She skipped the dolphin's question, she stirred every spine of a sea egg, tickling your palm, rank with the sea. She shut the ducts of a starfish, she was the mind messenger, and her speed out-darted memory. She was the swift that he had seen in the cedars in the foam of clouds, when she had shot across. When she had shot across the blue ridges of the waves to a god's orders, and he at the beck of her beak watched the bird hum the whipping Atlantic and felt he was headed home, where whales burst into flower and sails turned back from a tiring horizon. She shot with curled feet close to her wet belly, round-eyed, her ruddering beak towing in God we troused so fast that he felt his feet drumming on the ridged keelboard, its shearing motion, whirred by the swift's flywheel into open ocean. He gets to Africa, back to his own village in his memory, and he lives there for a while. But after a while, another tribe comes in and attacks the village, and his ancestors are captured, and he sees this, sees the other tribe come in and sees other members of his tribe and take them down to the beach to sell them as slaves. The village is empty, and as he walks around the village in this dream, he hears a man in a corner groaning. He goes into this empty hut, and he sees the old man groaning and moaning for the capture of the tribe. And that griot is the equivalent of Homer. He is the figure that always happens with every tribe, the one who contains the history of the tribe. So he stops outside the hut. Now he heard the griot muttering his prophetic song of sorrow that would be the past. It was a note long, drawn, and endless in its winding like the brown river's tongue. We were the color of shadows when we came down with tinkling leg irons to join the chains of the sea, the silver coins multiplying on the souled horizon. And these shadows are reprinted now on the white sand of antipodal coasts, your ashen ancestors from the bight of Benin, from the margin of Guinea. There were seeds in our stomachs, in the cracking pods of our skulls and the scorching decks, the tubers withered in no time. We watched as the river gods changed from snakes into currents. When inspected, our eyes showed dried fronds in their brown irises, and from our curved spines the rib cages radiated like fronds from a palm branch. Then, when the dead palms were heaved overside, the ribbed corpses floated, riding to the white sand they remembered, to the bight of Benin, to the margin of Guinea. So when you see burnt branches riding the swell, trying to reclaim the surf through crooked fingers, after a night of rough wind by some stone-white hotel, past the bright triangular passage of the windsurfers, remember us to the black waiter bringing the bill. But they crossed, they survived. There is the epical splendor. Multiply the rain's lances, multiply their ruin, the grace born from subtraction as the hole's iron door rolled over their eyes like pots left out in the rain, and the bolt rammed home its echo the way that thunderclaps perpetuate their reverberation. So there went the Ashanti one way, the Mandingo another, the Igbo another, the Guinea. Now each man was a nation to himself, without mother, father, brother. The worst crime is to leave a man's hands empty. Men are born makers with that primal simplicity in every maker since Adam. This is prehistory, that itching instinct in the crisscrossed net of their palms, its wickerwork. They could not stay idle too long. The chained wrists can't forget the carver for whom antelopes leapt, or the bow maker the shaft, or the armorer his nail studs, the shield held up to Hector that was the hammerer's art. So the wet air revolved in the potter's palms. In the painter's eye, the arcs of a frantic spring bucked soundlessly. Baboons kept signing their mimetic alphabet in case men forgot it. So out of habit their fingers grew leaves in the fetid ground of the boat. So now they were coals, firewood, dismembered branches, not men. They had left their remembered shadows in the firelight. Scratching a board, they made the signs for their fading names on the wood, and their former shapes returned absently. Each carried the nameless freight of himself to the other world. Then after wreaths of seaweed, after the bitter nouns of strange berries, coral saws, after the familiar irons singing round their ankles, after the circling suns, dry sand their souls knew, sand they could recognize, men they knew by their hearts. They came up from the darkness past the disinterested captains, shielding their eyes. Not where russet lions snarl on leaf-blown terraces, or where ocelots carry their freckled shadows, or wind erases Assyria, or where drizzling arrows hit the unflinching faces of some Thracian phalanx winding down mountain passes, but on a palm shore, with its vines and river grasses and stone barracoons on brown earth bare as their asses. Yet they felt the sea wind tying them into one nation of eyes and shadows and groans, in the one pain that is inconsolable, the loss of one shore with its crooked footpath. They had wept not for their wives only, their fading children, but for strange, ordinary things. This one who was a hunter wept for a sapling lance whose absent heft sang in his palm's hollow. One, a fisherman, for an ochre river encircling his calves. One, a weaver, for the straw fishpot he had meant to repair, wilting in water. They cried for the little thing after the big thing. They cried for a broken gourd. It was only later that they talked to the gods who had not been there when they needed them. Their whole world was moving, or a large part of the world. And what began dissolving was the fading sound of their tribal name for the rain, the bright sound for the sun, a hissing noun for the river, and always the word never, and never the word again. Thank you.